Okay. So I have Scott Poenitzsch with me, and Scott and I are colleagues from quite a while ago. We used to work at Gardner Denver together,
Correct.
and we had different roles. Scott was in uh, the management. Why don't you tell us?
Sure. At
Tell us.
Gardner Denver, my title was Vice President of Manufacturing Services. So there I managed five disciplines on a worldwide scale. I had the corporate capital investment, the corporate lean, corporate quality assurance, corporate transportation, and then finally a corporate R&D services. Basically would augment the different divisions' R&D services.
Okay. Yeah, it's quite a few things there.
Mhm.
Yeah. And I was an engineer there. I was supporting the manufacturing group there in the facility there.
Mhm.
And I think we worked together, I don't know, a couple of years or so.
Yeah, I was
And
at Gardner Denver for about 5 years.
okay, okay, then it was more than it must have been because I was there that whole time too. So
Mhm.
okay, great. And both of us have gone on to do other things. And so why don't you kind of give us a quick kind of a summary of what you've been doing all these years since what was that like oh 05, oh 06 or
Oh,
so,
yeah, it does go back
2005?
quite a bit of time, yeah.
Yeah.
So from Gardner Denver, let's see here. I went to a company in central Wisconsin as their vice president of manufacturing, and we were the largest plastic thermoformer in the United States. And the company made plastic pallets. So I had a very large operation in Portage, Wisconsin, and a very large operation in Marion, Indiana. And we were producing probably about 10,000 pallets a day. And they would make
Wow.
their way into the supply chain of a number of companies like Conagra Foods, Kraft Foods, Walmart, things of that nature.
Okay.
Mhm. And then from
Quite a few.
there, I moved to Texas and I was vice president of the Americas for a heat exchanger company. And my P&L was Canada to Brazil. I had facilities in Canada, United States, Mexico, and South America. And that company created or manufactured very large heat exchangers that you'd find in a lot of process industries like ethanol manufacturing, oil and gas manufacturing, even such things as chilling ice for ice skating rinks, like for professional
Okay.
hockeys and that stuff. So I did
Okay.
that for about 6 years. And then I decided to kind of do something totally different, get out of the corporate life. And about 2.5 years ago, my wife and I bought a commercial winery and vineyard operations here in North Texas.
Hmm. That is quite a change.
It is.
So, what drove you to do that? You kind of
Well, throughout my entire career, I've been very blessed. I've worked for some very fine companies, had some really great staffs, but it was also about working for somebody else, either for a CEO, a president, or a board of directors. This time around, I wanted to use my experience in the business world and do something for my family. So, and
okay.
we enjoy drinking wines. We've been to a number of wineries in the California and South Texas. We kind of like that lifestyle. And it's a really interesting job. We say today we've got the best job in the world because one day we're a farmer working in the vineyards. The next day we're a chemist creating wines. And then lastly, we say we're salespeople when we greet and meet guests that come to our tasting room and that stuff. So all my years of experience, I'm bringing to bear in a business that kind of supports our family.
Okay. Sounds really like you got all kinds of things to do. You're probably learning a lot of new things that you never did before, even though you've done a lot of stuff already.
There's never 2 days that are alike, which is pretty fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. And okay. And so we'll keep on going into that, but I'd like to hear about kind of like if you look back on everything you've done, what did you find the most satisfying out of all your different roles?
Most satisfying. That's a good question. Like I said before, I felt very blessed at every company that I've worked for. But I would say probably the one that was probably the most interesting was my time at Gardner Denver. First off, I worked for an incredible CEO, Ross Centani. and I was part of the organization that helped him grow the business from about $1 billion to about $2 billion in a very short period of time. And even though I had the worldwide responsibilities of the Vice President of Manufacturing Services, I was also part of the due diligence team that looked for strategic acquisitions. And then when we found them, I kind of helped through the process of making the acquisition and then the post-acquisition integration. So it was a really busy time in my life. I got a chance to travel the world looking for strategic businesses to bolt into the Gardner Denver portfolio. Met a lot of fascinating people, still have a lot of friends worldwide from those years. So that
Mm,
probably was the most satisfying, but clearly the most busy part of my life.
okay. So I have a suspicion my next question may be related to that, but I'll leave it open. So what was the most challenging thing you've had to deal with in your career?
Most challenging. I would say the next business that I worked at was a company called Trienda. And like I mentioned, they were the largest thermoforming company in the United States, and they made plastic pallets. When I joined the company, they had bought two very large thermoforming machines that could produce three pallets about every 90 seconds. But they were not running quite well. They had struggled for about 8 months to install them, and the intent was is to load plastic sheet on one end. It would thermoform the pallet. The pallet would come out, hand off to a robot. The robot would do all the finishing and then stack it. Well, that company made the leap to go to full automation, having no background in automation. And I think they missed a couple of gaps along the way for getting the tools installed for full automated operation, to get the robots coordinated. And when I walked in there, they were struggling to meet customer demand. Customer demand, like I said, was around 10,000 a day, and they were struggling to get 2 and 3,000 pallets a day out. So every day they got further in arrears. So I had
Mm,
to sit down and kind of sort through, what did you guys buy? Who were the main players in the integration? And finally, I just brought everybody that supplied the plastic to the tools to the integrator, the robots. We all sat in a room and said, what happened here? So from that moment forward, we all kind of got a good idea of what the vision was, and we started chiseling away at all the problems. And probably took me 6 to 8 months to get the thing running. But I got to tell you, after about, like I said, 8 months to a year, both large thermoformings were running in a fully automated mode, and it was pretty cool to see it running.
mm. And so I guess it sounds like it was you by doing all that you were able to make them more profitable if they weren't profitable before
Yes.
or
Yes. Well, they were a
yeah.
profitable business, but like I said, the customer satisfaction was like almost zero. Every day the customer would call very upset. How come there wasn't 10,000 on the truck? Because they subsequently had to supply their customers, and we had our back against the wall for at least 6 to 8 months till we got it all sorted out.
Mm,
And so then with the machines running properly, we had quite a bit of reserve capacity. So the 10,000 pallets a day became no issue to produce.
okay,
Mhm.
great. Well, it sounds like you turned it into a success.
It
The
was,
challenge
but
that was thrown at you.
it was overwhelming to begin with, too. It,
Yeah.
no, and the problems were not consistent. They moved all through the process. Uh, Again, when you get into an automated mode, you got to make sure that your variability is minimized. Plastic sheet would come in with a little variation in thickness, a little variation in temperature, and all of that screws up a fully automated process if it doesn't have the ability to adjust on the fly. And that's what was happening.
Sure. Yeah. Wow. All right. Well, and then I do have some more. I actually was going to get into that type of thing, automation and robotics, and maybe we can talk about that some too here,
Sure.
since that you brought that up. So I'm interested in like there's been a lot of technology changes over the last however many years. I like to think of like 20 years as kind of a good time frame to kind of size things up. And I wonder about what your perspective. That's a great example of what you just told us about. But what about like if in general for other companies that are doing manufacturing and they want to think about they're kind of in that decision phase of going into more automation, either with robotics or other types of automated equipment.
Mhm.
Um, do you what do you recommend? What do you advise a company that's in that situation trying to decide what they should do?
Certainly. Well, as time has moved on, uh, the price tag of automation has certainly come down. Like if you look at when robots first came into the being, they were pretty expensive. I think the average industrial robots are very affordable for a lot of firms. But I would also say to you, don't automate for sake of automation. I think it should be applied in areas that it's truly needed. And three things come to mind real quickly that I would certainly be an embracer of installing a robot. First off, would be like a hazardous material or hazardous environment. Let's say something like a foundry or something like that, where you may have some gases or extreme temperatures or extreme heats that you really wouldn't want an employee subjected to for 8 hours. I think that's a great operation for placing a robot on. The
Okay.
second one I would look at would be high repetition, like assembly operations. Like if you have individuals assembling and driving screws into assemblies, you might get the carpal tunnel syndrome and that stuff. So again, high repetition type jobs where the robot would be really ideally suited for. And then finally, maybe some assembly processes where the human hand is just not delicate enough to kind of guide a piece of material in. Like, for instance, they're using robots today in surgery. The Da Vinci machine is a classic example of a robotic device that is much more sensitive and much more delicate than a human hand can do. So those are
Hmm.
types of applications that I certainly would embrace. But again, I'll say it again, don't put a robot in there if the process isn't stable to begin with. I wouldn't recommend it. You're just adding another layer of complexity that'll probably not be satisfying.
Okay. Those are good points. Okay. All right. And then I'd be interested in what you've seen. So, kind of also along the lines of technology changing, what other changes have you seen in the business world as kind of from a management standpoint or the way businesses are run today versus some time back? What's the biggest things you've been seeing that changed?
Well, technology advances, I think, are always coming. Change is something that will always be with us. And I think you need to have a change adaptive organization so you don't get complacent in that stuff. So keep driving the employees forward, embrace the change, because if you don't, you could stagnate and your competitor could leapfrog you, and then you'll be standing there figuring out what just happened. We talk a little bit about the technology also. The 3D printing is coming around. When I remember 3D printing coming to fruition probably 10, 15 years ago, it was really for more of an R&D type of a thing. You'd have a stereolithography machine or other types of technology that you can make a device to hold and touch and see how the pieces going together, but they were really not functioning models. They were somewhat brittle, like if you dropped it, it would crack and things like that. Today's technology, they can 3D print quite a bit of things that are very robust now. So for
Mhm.
those areas that you've got short runs where you can't justify say a injection molding tool or a die casting tool or forging tool, I think 3D technology is a great application to use those things going forward. And then
Okay.
I'll say the same thing, supply chain. The longer your supply chain from where you're sourcing your materials from, either your direct materials or other things like that, if you don't manage that supply chain, you're going to run out of something or you're going to have too much of something else. So my recommendation, I would have said this 20 years ago, I'll say it 20 years from now, manage your supply chain. Time,
Mm.
delivery, quality, all those aspects.
Mm. Do you think that uh, it's become easier or harder to do that in that over the years?
Things become harder.
It's
So
become
if you
harder.
go back, let's go back, say 40 or 50 years, a lot of companies were vertically integrated. So Ford Motor Company back in the early 20s was a great example. They had their own foundries. They could stamp their own sheet metal. They would machine it, assemble it. So they only had to reach across to another Ford employee to manage that supply chain. And everything was fairly local. Well, as things got more complex, companies got into more specialization. So they started divorcing the forging, let's say, and the machining operations, but they would push them to suppliers that were, say, within 2 or 3 or 4 hour radius. So if you had a problem with quality or problem with delivery, you literally just had to pick the phone up and talk to somebody, a couple counties, maybe a state over, right? Now there was a rush back in the 80s and 90s to move production to Mexico. So I can tell you that I was part of that. Business, getting product across the border in a timely manner. Also, now you're speaking with different cultures and different languages. There could be some of those barriers. So again, another issue of quality, language, getting the technology and the specifications correct. Well, that worked out well, and then all of a sudden there was the push to go to China. So now you've got another longer distance. Now instead of just driving it up from Mexico, you have to worry about ocean freight. You got to worry about export coming out of Hong Kong or coming into Long Beach, California. You've got a number of delay factors. If and you have 12 to 14 weeks of lead time. That probably before you only had 14 to 10 days. A lot of people went over there. They got the manufacturers to produce the product, and then there was a quality issue. So then you got to step back and go, how much defects do I have in the supply chain? Is it everything that's at that factory plus what's on the ocean plus in my warehouse? So then it would take a lot of time and cost to recover from that, sorting, move it off to the side, and get replenished product coming in. So again, the further you go, the more cultures and the more challenges and the more variations, that supply chain becomes very, very difficult to manage if you don't have a
Hmm.
control over it.
Yeah. Wow. Sounds like people have to step up even more than they ever did
Understand
today.
who you're buying products from is all I'll tell you.
All right. So, and this also may tie into that what you just talked about. And I'm interested in like being competitive. So, uh, what do companies that are especially manufacturing need to do to be as competitive as possible?
So I'll answer it in two questions. Again, the supply chain issue. I think those companies that manage a good supply chain are much more competitive and more agile and resilient to changes in the marketplace. Things change, come and go, but if you've got product that reaches out 7, 8, 9 months, you could be standing with a lot of product if the market shifts on you. The
Mhm.
second thing would be also know who your customers, know who your target market is. You know, I've talked to a lot of entrepreneurs who've got this great product that says everybody wants it. And most likely not. Okay. So who are you trying to, what is that need that you're trying to satisfy? Who's your target market? And make sure you get to know them very intimately, that you're producing products, both current and future products, for a need that's in the marketplace.
Mm. Okay. And so, and on the point of entrepreneurs and small companies, if they want to grow their business, what's kind of some basic guidelines for growing your business?
So again, I'll come back to two things too. For small entrepreneurs, it's even more risky than larger corporations. Like if a large corporation makes a mistake, they can absorb the mistake and go, well, that product didn't sell well, move it off to the side. An entrepreneur, a small business, doesn't have that luxury. If they make a mistake, it could take them potentially out of business and that stuff. So again, know your target market, know the value that you create, and know what needs you're satisfying. Very important. The second piece for a small entrepreneur is working capital. As you continue to grow, at some point in time, you're going to have to reach out to an investor, a bank, or some other source of capital to continue to fuel that engine, to buy more raw materials, to buy other things to keep feeding that growth cycle. So I would say make sure you've got a great relationship with your bank or your investor community so that they can continue to provide funds for that growth.
Okay. That's a good point. Okay. And so we did talk about technology, and you also including 3D printing.
Hmm.
And I've been kind of checking out what's going on with the 3D printing technology and how it's being used. And something I've seen is that I guess it's definitely come a long way from what I've seen. And I'm curious about like when can you say you're traditionally doing machining of metal parts, um, and you wanted to switch or somehow leverage 3D printing. Um, is there how do you decide that? Like, I mean, I know 3D printing is kind of a still a relatively slow process. It takes, if you want to make, depending on the size of the part, it
Hmm.
takes quite a while to make one part. So there's probably something that helps you decide what's practical for switching over or supplementing your standard
Hmm.
practices
Hmm.
to 3D printing.
Hmm.
So what would you say people should think about when they are trying to decide that?
3D printing to me is just a methodology to produce a component. Okay. So let's just say you've got a steel plate, a bracket. Well, that bracket can be forged, that bracket can be cast, bracket can be machined from billet stock, or it could be stamped, right? Those are all processes to produce a bracket. Now, if you
Mhm.
decide to do a 3D printing process, I would say again, make sure that the material that's selected is of a strength and a quality that satisfies the functionality of the part that you're trying to produce. Like I said, if you're making a bracket out of metal, I don't know if they can 3D print a bracket out of metal, or would you have to go to a polymer? And would that polymer product have the same strength and needs that the metal bracket is to? So you have to look at what materials that the 3D can be printed. I have seen recently, for instance, 3D printing of masonry brick. So they're taking the same slurry that you would get to make brick, they're 3D printing house structures now using the same thing. So I thought that was
Hmm.
pretty cool. Same base material, just a different process on making the end product.
Yeah, and I mean, if they, like I said, I've seen it where it takes like hours to make a part,
Hmm.
and then if you need to produce whatever, maybe you
Correct.
want to make 100 parts a day or something like that. You need 100 parts a day to fulfill your customer
Right.
demand. So is that a practical? Is there a practical way to achieve that with 3D printing, or are we
Well,
still not there yet?
I think it can, but it gets back to it's a cost versus benefit equation. You know, if you go back to the bracket example, go there. If you want to make a bracket, you have to go buy a stamping die, which would maybe take 10 to 12 weeks to make, possibly, and it may cost you $30,000 before you can make your first bracket. Okay. Well, then you'd probably want to sell an awful lot of brackets to recoup the investment cost of that tooling, right? But if your customer says he only wants 50 brackets, man, that's a lot of money to produce 50 brackets. So it's possible that the 3D printing, if it satisfies the material needs, yeah, we make one every, say, 10 hours, but it's still a lot less expensive than buying the stamping die, 10-week lead time, and then you can make a stamped product in seconds. But the total cost of that product will be much more competitive. So
Okay.
it depends on how many the requirements of your customer are of what you're trying to make.
Okay. Makes sense. Okay. Thank you. And you also talked about going to other countries, Mexico and China, and how there's challenges involved with that. So,
I was just going to point out to you. So you just brought up something that's just coming. So I remember a period of time in the not too distant past, and it's forefront in the news as we speak. We were supplying or we were sourcing product from China back when we were building facility and looking for suppliers, and suddenly there was the avian flu, the bird flu, right? Well, it was quarantine where nobody from China could come to the States. I couldn't send any of my quality people over there. And we started running into some situations where we were running out of product because nobody could travel to the countries, right? That's happening almost as we speak. They're starting to shut down portions of China for another flu that's come to being. So the stock market has taken a hit today. All these factors that, you remember I said manage the supply chain, there's
Hmm.
still variables out there that you're not going to have any control over, and it potentially could adversely affect. So the longer your supply chain is, the more challenges you have. Versus if you're buying a product, again, 100 miles away, chances are the avian flu is probably not going to inhibit your supply chain.
So I'm kind of reading into that. You're discouraging people from companies from doing a lot of outsourcing to overseas.
If you're not good
Is
at it, be careful. But again, let's go a step further. The current administration is opening up doors to allow some products to come back into the United States to be made more economically. I think I saw an announcement of some of the large automotive manufacturers are starting to bring product back to the United States for manufacturing because
mhm.
certain cost of doing it here in the States has reduced itself. And again, the supply chain is much more shorter than it is trying to bring product in from Canada, Mexico, China, Vietnam. You know, who knows what the next sourcing location.
Mm, yeah.
All I said to you before was change is inevitable and change will happen, and it's happening now.
Mm, yeah. So I guess maybe you're kind of like you would prefer, and if it's up to your company, you would prefer to just keep it all domestic, everything you
Mhm.
do domestic,
I'd prefer.
and yeah, and then only if there's some other force that tells you you have to do it, you have to go overseas for some reason, whether it's just not possible to do something here. Uh,
Well, it
I
could be a cost driver. It could be availability of a particular component. You know, you must buy it from Europe, let's say, or you must buy it from China because it's simply not available anywhere else. So those are the factors. But in a perfect world, from a manufacturing, put your hat on, I would prefer the company be as vertically integrated as possible, as
mm,
long as it stays within their core competencies. And then if that doesn't seem to be the case, then build your supplier network as close as you possibly can.
mm, okay. And that's definitely favorable too, also for for jobs in the U.S. and for keeping more uh, all the production that we do. The more we can do it in the U.S., it'll feed our economy more than if it
There's a
would
lot
if we were to
there's
outsource it.
a lot of upside to doing that. I would agree.
Yeah, so that sounds like a very kind of a strong recommendation to try to do more domestic uh, production.
I would agree.
Okay, great. All right. And then if a company is small or large, you were talking too about is taking a small company and what they should take into account when they're trying to grow. And maybe you've kind of already touched on some of that. But if you were to compare and contrast as a small and a large company, um, those all those kind of comments you gave us so far, are they universal to small or large companies, or is there something that's
Yeah, I'd say
unique about each?
the largest company that I had the ability to work for was Gardner Denver, and that was just a little over a $2 billion organization. I've also been president and CEO of a company that's about 2 million in sales. So those are almost day and night different. Both are mechanical, industrial type products manufacturers. But I would say, again, the risks to the smaller company are much more exorbitant if something goes wrong. Like, again, Gardner Denver, they can make a mistake, have a product go wrong. They could have an interruption in their supply chain and they would suffer. But a small company, if they ran out of components and they're sourcing it from overseas, could put them straight down. They could run the company into bankruptcy. Because if you're
Mm,
not supplying your customer base and you force them to go looking for a competitive product, they may not come back to you,
yeah,
right? Once they make the switch, they may not come back. So now
right.
you've permanently destroyed that avenue of revenue for your company.
Okay, right. And you had talked about that. I think in any company's case, they need to be focused on their customers, make sure they understand the customer's needs, and get that feedback from them, make sure they're satisfying them. And so I'm sure that's true for sure. The small company is going to have to make sure they do that. And, there's no room for error in their case, right?
Well, and again, you just touched on customer satisfaction. I think that is absolutely key. Don't ever lose that. I see a lot of companies making the mistake not having good customer service or having that bonding to solve the problem of the customer. And I'll give you an example. I ran a compressor company a number of years ago that we would supply this component. It was the component in this medical device. It was the A component. And we were not the least expensive compressor on the market. There were cheaper versions. But we would guarantee our customers a 48-hour lead time. So if you gave us a order on Monday, we would ensure that your A component would be arriving within 48 hours on your dock. Okay.
Mm,
So were there Chinese equivalents? Absolutely. But remember the long supply chain and the ability to manage that and having all that money tied up in inventory? Our solution was is we're going to stay real close to you. We're going to show you the last 6 months, the last 2 quarters, the last 3 quarters of your demand and help you forecast what you need. And then we'll take the risk. Internally, we had our supply chain working so well that we literally could build product within 7 days. So my
mm,
risk was is I would take 4 or 5 days of inventory to ensure a 40-hour lead time to our customers. And we won the market with that. We went to each one of those customers and said, here's our plan. You guys can reduce your inventory, and then we'll be like a Kanban system to you guys. And they were nervous at the beginning. They're like, don't run me out of compressors. Nope, I get it. Don't worry about that. And we commanded that market for several years and getting a good price for our product in the face of some pretty stiff offshore competition that was less expensive.
okay.
So that was the value we created, and fortunately, the customers recognize that value and are willing to pay for it.
Yeah. Great. Okay. You talked about funding and how if you having capital available to grow your business and run your business. So if we were to focus in on investors, for example, if a company is trying to attract investors and kind of package themselves and be ready to take investors on, what is some advice you can offer them?
So I'm going to stay on the small entrepreneur first, okay? Because corporations have a lot of legal help to do that, and there's a number of resources available to them as they go from a private entity to maybe do an initial public offering, things like that. So let's stay on the smaller end of the entrepreneur. I would strongly suggest that the entrepreneur gets a good relationship with the SBA, the Small Business Association, in their areas. They are a wealth of information to help them with things like business plans or to help them with sorting out who their target market is. And then when they get to the point of funding, they can either help them through the SBA to get an SBA loan or maybe to get them tied into some maybe angel investors in the community or even to tie them into some regular banks or credit unions and things like that. That is a tremendous source of a whole host of issues that face an entrepreneur, a small business owner.
Hmm. Okay, great. That's good advice. Okay. And then for young people that are trying to become established in business today, what would you give them advice towards what's the highest priority they should give attention to starting out?
Highest priority would, again, find out who your target market is. If you've got this widget, okay, again, I've heard many people say everybody needs what I've designed, and that's just not true. Not everybody has the problem that you're trying to solve. So figure out who your target market is, who your ideal customer is, and focus your energies on that. And you'll find out that it's not everybody, but it is people that have the problem, willing to spend money to purchase your product. That's one thing
Mm-hmm.
I would do. The second thing I would do is, again, I talked about the SBA, get your good relationship with the Small Business Association. But lastly, try to find a mentor in your community, somebody that might be a CEO or a vice president of a company that's willing to give back to the community, and try to get at a mentor relationship and learn from those individuals, years of experience, so that maybe
Mm-hmm.
you can avoid some pitfalls as you go forward and don't fall into the same things they did. There's a
Mm-hmm.
number of people out there that are maybe nearing retirement or in the retirement years that would love to give back to the next wave of younger entrepreneurs.
Okay, that's good too. Good advice. All right. Well, I think I've got all the questions I was curious about answered. I thought I'd give you a chance to talk about your winery that you've been running and kind of give yourself some advertising for that.
Sure. So the name of our winery is Horseshoe Bend Cellars Vineyard and Winery, located right outside of Wichita Falls, Texas, which is about 2 hours northwest of Dallas, almost to the Oklahoma border. It's a full commercial winery. We have some vineyards on property. We do acquire some juices and grapes from other commercial vineyards, because today I've got 22 wines in the portfolio, and I don't grow 22 different grape varietals and that stuff. But we have the ability to bring in grapes, crush the grapes, get the juices extracted. We have a number of very large fermentation tanks that we convert the juices to wine. We have some barrel aging. We have a fully automated bottling system, and we're pretty pleased about what we've done here. It was an existing business that we acquired. It was a turnaround and a rebranding. So both of those things are a challenge. If you
Mm.
turn it around with the same name, that's one thing. But if you turn it around and change the name, you've got an awful lot of marketing to do to get people to understand that, oh, that's the new winery. So I'm pleased that it's a family business. My oldest daughter, who lives in Wisconsin, does a little bit of our food pairings to our wines and makes recommendations, and has written a couple of magazine articles featuring our wines. My son lives in Milwaukee, does some market research for us, and kind of points to what the new and upcoming wines will be. Our middle daughter lives in St. Louis, and she does all of our social media, our branding, our logo wear, all of that. She's our chief creative officer. And then finally, our youngest daughter, Gabrielle, is our general manager, and she pretty much runs the day-to-day aspects of this business.
Okay.
So we've modified or grown into just beyond the wines. We do monthly pairings of wines, so like Italian dishes. We've partnered with a really good chef in town here in Wichita Falls that comes out and caters our special dinners, from German dinners to Cajun nights to Italian dinners. We're also doing magic shows here. We do tableside magic the third Thursday of every month, which is a booming success. And then finally, for the last 7 or 8 months, our number one event here is murder mystery dinners at the winery. So we convert the winery. The theme we're doing now is a 1920s speakeasy. People
Mm.
come and have dinner in costume, so it's in character.
Mm.
Have dinner. One of the gangsters gets rubbed out, and then they spend the rest of the evening solving the murder. It's an awful lot of fun. We have a lot of fun doing it as well too.
Yeah, sounds like it. So, are you? How are you distributing that wine? Do you?
So today, our permit for making wine allows us to self-distribute. So what we've been mainly doing is focusing in on the greater Wichita Falls area, which encompasses about 105,000 in the city, but probably close to 250,000 in all the adjoining counties. So that's our focus, but we are right now in the midst of signing a contract for a distribution that'll get me to probably about 45% of the state of Texas. So we're at that growth cycle
Hmm.
now where we're looking to push ourselves out into a much greater reach for our products.
Okay. Sounds like you're got a rapid growth trajectory there.
We are. It's been, like I said, we've been at this for about 2 years, and we're at a point in our growth cycle that I'm very pleased about for being only a 2-year-old winery.
Yeah. Okay.
So I would just
Great.
say, whoever watching this, we do post frequently on Facebook. That's our main media push out for things going on. We do have a website that we share a lot of our information with. We also are on LinkedIn a little bit. We do some postings out there. And then we have an Instagram account as well too. So we're doing all the social media. We do some print. We do some TV ads. So I would just say we do quite a bit of marketing for all those different avenues to touch as many customers and potential customers as we can.
Yeah. Hmm. Wow. That's, yeah. Sounds like you're very active there promoting the products.
We are.
All right. Well, it's been a great conversation. I've got a lot of good information from you, and it's been very interesting and enjoyable. So I'm glad we did this.
Yeah, it's been my
Yeah. All right. So thank you very much. And appreciate your time, Scott.
Thank you very much for asking me. See you
All
later.
right.